Every time a patient asks me if depression is just a chemical imbalance, a small part of me dies inside. Not because it's a bad question, but because it means they've been given a version of this that's way too simple to actually help them. Because right now, there are two completely different stories about depression. One says it's all brain chemistry. Fix the chemicals and you're fine. The other says that idea is a myth, that antidepressants don't even work, and psychiatry is basically a scam. Both can sound convincing, but both are incomplete. And the truth sits right in the middle, but almost nobody explains it properly. So, I'm going to show you what depression actually is, based on what the science really says, and why getting this wrong might be the reason treatment hasn't worked the way that you expected. And who am I to step into the middle of one of the most misunderstood debates in mental health? My name is Dr. Sulman Aziz Mirza, triple board certified in adult psychiatry, child and adolescent psychiatry, and addiction medicine. And I spend my days getting threatened by people on social media who think I should find a new job. Here's the model that most people are walking around with, whether they realize it or not. Your brain runs low on serotonin. That causes depression. Antidepressants bring it back up. Problem solved. It's clean, it's intuitive, and for a long time, it was actually useful. Because before this model existed, depression wasn't seen as a medical issue. It was seen as a personal failure. You were lazy, you were weak, you weren't trying hard enough. The chemical imbalance idea changed that. It gave people language. It gave them something real to point to. It helped people get treatment who otherwise would have stayed silent. So this model did do something important, but it also left something out. And that's where things start to break. Because now there are 3 beliefs most people have about depression, and 2 of them are incomplete. And one of them is actively misleading. Let's start with the first one, because this is the foundation that everything else is built on. Myth number 1, depression is just low serotonin. Serotonin is real, and it matters, but treating it like the whole story is like trying to understand an entire orchestra by listening to one instrument. It gives you something, but it misses almost everything that actually makes the system work. And that misunderstanding leads directly to the second myth, which is where things really start to go wrong. Myth 2. If the serotonin theory isn't correct, then antidepressants don't work. You've probably seen the headlines, Serotonin theory of depression debunked. It spread fast back in 2022, and the way it was reported, it sounded like psychiatry had just admitted to a 40-year mistake. But that's not what Joanna Moncrief et al.'s study actually showed. And what it did show is a lot more interesting. We'll come back to that one. Because first, there's a third belief, and this one quietly shapes how people see the entire field. Myth 3, psychiatrists are just pushing pharmaceutical narratives. There is some truth buried in that. Misprescribing is real. But criticizing how a tool is used isn't the same as saying the tool itself doesn't work. And mixing those 2 things together is where people start to lose trust in treatments that could actually help them. So right now, the conversation is being pulled in 2 completely different directions, and both of them miss what's actually going on. Because if depression isn't low serotonin, well, what is it? That's where the real science starts. So here's the idea I want you to hold for the rest of this video. Depression isn't one broken chemical. It's a system that's not running the way it's supposed to. And once you see it that way, everything else, diagnosis, treatment, and even how people talk about it, starts to make more sense. Because your brain isn't just a bag of chemicals. It's more like a car. You've got fuel, wiring, sensors, moving parts, all working together. And when something goes wrong, it's usually not just one thing. It's multiple systems starting to drift out of sync at the same time. So let's walk through what that actually looks like, because this is the part that almost never makes it into the headlines. There are 4 main systems involved, and each one affects the others. First, the fuel system. This is your brain chemistry. And yes, serotonin is part of it, but so is dopamine, which drives motivation and reward, and norepinephrine, which affects energy, focus, and your stress response. These don't operate independently. They regulate each other. So when one gets thrown off, the others shift with it. And focusing only on serotonin is like trying to fix a car that won't start by only checking the gas, when the problem could be the battery, the wiring, or the engine itself. Second, the electrical system. This is your brain's circuits. Depression doesn't just change chemicals, it changes how signals actually move through the system. The motivation circuits, the reward pathways, the prefrontal cortex, the part that's responsible for decision making and emotional regulation, these systems start to underperform, which is why someone who's depressed can't just think their way out of it. It's not a willpower problem. It's like pressing the gas pedal and the signal just isn't getting where it needs to go. Third, the engine conditions. This is the body, and this part gets overlooked constantly. Sleep disruption, chronic inflammation, hormonal changes, especially stress hormones like cortisol. These aren't just side effects. In many cases, they're part of what's causing the system to struggle in the first place. Poor sleep throws off regulation. Inflammation interferes with how the system functions overall. Hormones affect mood, energy, and cognition. If the engine isn't running properly, even something as simple as overdue maintenance can throw everything off. And fourth, the driving conditions. This is the environment, stress, trauma, isolation. Even a perfectly functioning car will struggle if you're driving it through rough terrain non-stop. And that's why even people with the same genetics don't have the same experience with depression. Because environment changes how the whole system performs. So instead of thinking of depression as one thing being low, think of it as a car that's not running right. Maybe it still moves, but something feels off. And the more systems that start to slip, the harder it becomes to keep it going. That's a much closer picture of what depression actually is. And once you understand that, treatment starts to make a lot more sense. Because antidepressants aren't just adding fuel. What research suggests is that they actually help the system become more adaptable, more able to adjust, repair, and reroute when something isn't working properly. That process is called neuroplasticity. So instead of just trying to fix one part, they're helping the system become capable of functioning better overall. And that's a completely different way of understanding what these medications are actually doing. Which also explains something that most people get wrong. By fixing one part alone often isn't enough to get the whole system running smoothly again. So let's come back to that 2022 Moncrief paper for a second. The one that got turned into the serotonin theory of depression has been debunked. Because this is where the conversation really starts to drift. What that paper actually showed was something much more narrower. That depression isn't explained by a simple low serotonin equals depression model. That's it. But the way that got interpreted is where things started to go off track. Because here's the leap that people made. If serotonin isn't the cause, then antidepressants shouldn't work. And on the surface, that sounds logical. But it's built on a bad assumption. That we fully understood the system in the first place. We didn't. And we still don't. Because a treatment can work even if our explanation for it was incomplete. Aspirin reduced fevers for decades before anyone understood how it actually worked. It's the same idea over here. Just because serotonin isn't the whole story, it doesn't mean that medications targeting that system do nothing. It means the system is more complex than the model we started with. So when do medications actually fall short? In my experience, it's usually not because the treatment doesn't work, it's because it's being used on the wrong version of the problem. I've had lots of patients who have tried multiple antidepressants over several years with very little improvement. And on the surface, it looked like the medications just weren't effective. But when we stepped back and looked at the bigger picture, their sleep had been severely disrupted. There were signs of chronic stress, underlying health issues. The system was still under strain. The medication was doing something, but it wasn't touching the parts of the system that were actually keeping things stuck. Once we started to address those pieces, alongside the medication, things start to shift. Not overnight, but in a way medication alone hadn't been able to produce. That's the difference. It's not that the medication didn't work. It just wasn't solving the part of the system that was actually keeping them stuck. And that's why, for a lot of people, medication alone isn't enough for the version of the problem that they're dealing with. So, if you've ever felt like you've tried something and it kind of helped, but not enough, that doesn't mean that you're stuck. It doesn't mean nothing works. And it doesn't mean that you're the problem. It usually just means you haven't addressed the whole system yet. Because depression isn't one thing going wrong. It's multiple parts of a system falling out of sync. And each part responds to something different, which is why progress can feel inconsistent. Why one approach helps a little, but not completely. And why what works for someone else doesn't always work the same for you. But once you start looking at it through that lens, things get a lot less confusing. And a lot more actionable. Because now the question isn't just, does this work? It's, what part of the system is this actually targeting? And that's where things get more nuanced, especially when it comes to medication. Because not all antidepressants are created equal. Some can be genuinely helpful in the right context. And some, well, I avoid whenever possible. So if you want insight into my worst 5 antidepressants, the ones I tried and never prescribed, watch this next video linked down below. And until next time, be safe and be well.